to announce the opening of the conference, Preventive Measures to Counter Violence Against Children in Armed Conflicts. That's sponsored by the university's Network for the Protection of Children in Armed Conflicts, with the cooperation with the University of Kufa Faculty of Law. Now we are very pleased to invite the President of the University of Kufa, Professor Yasser Laftassoon, to start with his opening speech and the official announcement of the start of the conference. Please, Professor, the floor is for you now.
Thank you, dear. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome you here on the University of Kufa Faculty of Law. First of all, I want to thank everybody who arranged and managed to choose this title, this important title, and to manage this conference. As you know, that children are maybe the mostly affected by wars because they are innocent creatures who are not trained to withstand these abnormal circumstances. There is a high degree of child abuse, child killing, child isolation, and exposing the child to a bitter experience that maybe left with him for the whole of life. There are many countries affected by violences and by child abuse. If you remember the children of Rwanda children in North Syria, children of Iraq, and all over the world there is some sort of influence of war on children. In addition to that, their families, they suffer from poverty, homelessness, and destruction or killing or handicapping by the war. I hope that this conference will help this category of people in crossing and rehabilitation of their lives and their psychological aspects in order to reduce the effects and influences of wars and violence against children. Again, I would like to thank you for this effort, and I will be very happy to join you to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor, for your agreed speech. Now, with all expressions of thanks, we are pleased to join the Italian ambassador in Baghdad to participate in this conference. The floor now goes to His Excellency Ambassador Bruno Antonio Bacchino, Ambassador of Italy to Iraq. Please, the floor now for you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all for this event, for this initiative. And let me express my sincere thanks for having chosen the Italian embassy to represent the Italian government here in such an event. Let me express also the appreciation, the sincere appreciation for the work of the university's Network for Children in Armed Conflicts. My country is honored to support this work to promote a reflection of the academic world on these issues, which are fundamental for the future of our societies. The protection of the rights of the children is indeed one of the main priorities of Italy's action in the human rights field, including our current mandate as member of the Human Rights Council and during the upcoming Italian chairmanship of the Council of Europe. Italy believes that it's timely to continue raising awareness on this issue, especially considering the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, which have created everywhere in the world new challenges to children's rights, including their continued access to education. There is no word to define the awful, horrific impact on children living in war zones, since they have reduced access to schools, health services, other social services, apart from the physical and psychological sufferings they have endured. It is a moral imperative to put an end to the worst forms of violation of the rights of the children during armed conflicts. For example, killing and maiming them, recruitment or the use of children as soldiers, not talking of sexual violences, abductions, attacks against schools or hospitals, denial of humanitarian access, as it happened very close to Iraq in Syria, Preventive measures need to be strengthened to avert all these 6 extremely grave violations, including the one to prevent abuses by non-state actors, which is another issue which is very important for this area of the world, which more often recruit these non-state actors or use children as soldiers, and whose increased role in armed conflicts create new compelling challenges. In this regard, my country is committed in a number of initiatives. For example, on the occasions of the 23rd International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent in December 2019, Italy presented an open pledge to call on all the relevant actors to undertake all the necessary actions to reduce the impact of wars on the life of children. Since then, we are sparing no efforts, no diplomatic and personal efforts in promoting and implementing this initiative. These efforts include, for example, promoting the widest possible support to the initiative called Safe Schools Declaration, supported already by 107 states. Limitations in the access to education not only have an immediate impact on the life of affected children, but they also cause lifelong effects, reducing their opportunities to get a better life and leaving long-lasting psychological scars. On the contrary, continued access to schools not only keeps children away from the streets and the violence, but it's also a powerful tool to promote peace and prevent any further conflict. Last November, in the context of the latest edition of the Rome-Mediterranean Dialogue, the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs organized an event on children living in situations of armed conflicts, again, specifically aimed at increased cooperation according to the entire Middle East and North African region on this important issue. Let me mention other 2 successful initiatives Italy recently organized. One very recent, last March, for example, together with the universities network, for example, and in the margins of the 46th session of the Human Rights Council Geneva, it's been discussed the importance to ensure continued access to education to children, especially during conflicts. And the second one, during the 65th session of the United Nations Committee on the Status of Women in New York, Italy addressed the impact of violence against girl children during conflicts and the potentialities of the international criminal justice system to stop these unacceptable actions, in the belief that violations against girls and girl children take specific and the harsher imaginable forms. Let me conclude thanking you again wholeheartedly for this initiative. We all have in our eyes the images of children and of that among the other that beautiful video you started this conference with. Congratulations for those who did it and the organizers in general. We have the duty, professional and personal, I would say, not to forget, not even one moment, this necessary defense we have to give the children during armed conflicts. So thank you again for this initiative. Thank you for having chosen us to represent the Italian government, and thank you for our endeavor. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm grateful for your participation in our conference. Now we are pleased to join Her Excellency Safiya Suhail, Ambassador of the Republic of Iraq to Italy, and we are very grateful for her join us at this conference. Please, the floor now for you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fatlawi. And good morning to you all, organizers, speakers, participants, colleagues, Ambassador Bruno, and all those for this important conference of today. Allow me first to express my government gratitude and appreciation to the university's network for children in armed conflict and the University of Kufa for organizing this timely, very important conference. It's our fundamental duty to do everything in our power to protect children from chaos and madness of war, and that have nothing that children has to do with. As we addressing today the issue of protection of children in armed conflict, we have to admit that we all must do more to protect our children. My country, Iraq, as you all know, have suffered from scores of international terrorism, which affected all its citizens. The effect of armed conflict are felt hardest by women and children. As you all know, also Iraqi children were subject to most horrific abuses by the most criminal terror organization, ISIS, Daesh, which has been committed crimes fall under the 6 categories of grave violation identified by Security Council, namely the killing and the maiming of children, the recruitment and the use of children as soldiers, sexual violence against children, attacks on schools, hospitals, the denial of humanitarian assistance and the education of children. Daesh has also carried out the displacement of trafficking in Iraq children in the regions which was under its control. Daesh also committed the worst crimes against children, which has reached alarming level in their cruelty and criminality, which has been characterized as criminals against humanity and genocide and criminals or crimes against wars. Daesh has also targeted the educational sector in many ways. It has closed many schools and put them to use for their criminal ends during their occupation of several towns and villages of Mosul. They changed the education curriculum by adding subject matter that fuels hatred and incites violence and extremism and terrorism. So to influence the beliefs and the values of our children through miseducation. Daesh recruits our children by force them to commit acts of war in the service of that terrorist organization by carrying out widespread brainwashing operation in order to use children at a later point of suicide attack. Beyond all above mentioned crimes, Iraq children and their family were forced for the greatest wave of displaced Iraq has never experienced before. I can go on and on with more violation and crimes committed by this terrorist organization. But I think better is to stop here and to speak a little bit about what Iraqi government has been doing its best within its resource to constrain and to ensure that the protection of children are promoted and their rights should be really promoted. As you may know, that the Iraqi law of military service punished anyone who uses children under 18 in the military for any reason. We admit that the challenges are still there, and we do express our willingness to cooperate with any legitimate entity that can support plans and strategies can lead to the ending of the suffering of our children and the children of the world. Iraq, in the domestic laws of the Iraqi let's say legislation are being discussed and updated. The process of the amendment, which was needed, it has been implemented, but I admit it's a bit slow, but it did not stop at all. Those updates will make most of the international and local communities' concerns. On the 1st of March of 2021, the Iraqi parliament succeeded in passing the Yazidi Female Survivor Bill, a law aimed at providing assistance to the survivors of Daesh atrocities, including, of course, children. Internally displaced people is a main priority for the Iraqi government, which are working hard with local governments and communities for safe return to their towns and villages. Most of the camps of the family of Daesh are kept and are not a detention camps, rather than safe and guarded camps to protect those families from the retaliation of the people and the communities severely affected by Daesh. Reintegration and rehabilitation plans are being developed with the assistance of our international partners. And in that, I would like to thank Italy, which is really a main partner with the United Nations and many other European and international community and states who have been working hand in hand with the Iraqi government to support us to go back to a normal life where we can all together work on much more stability for those who have been from this criminal organization. I wish also to end by referring to the challenges that we have all faced globally. As communities, we all have been suffering from COVID-19, which is today became another barrier that complicated and actually interrupted the relief efforts by our government and the international partners and the civil society efforts and programs and strategic plans to be implemented. I would like to stop here, and I will be definitely with you during this conference for any kind of question that can be verified by Iraqi government of all the programs and the plans which has been adopted recently in order to overcome the suffering of our communities and in specific the children of Iraq. I thank you very much. And I do thank in specific Dr. Laura, my dear friend, and Dr. Fatlawi, and all those who have been really doing this effort in order to get us all together in such important, timely conference. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really honored and grateful for being with you today.
Thanks, Ambassador, for your great speech by reviewing the Iraqi situation and especially Iraqi children in terms of armed conflicts, and by review the Iraqi government and the process with this situation. Thanks very, very much. Now we are welcome Professor and my friend Laura Guercio, representative of the University's Network for Protection of Children in Armed Conflicts. And here I would like to extend my great gratitude for all the efforts that made by her with our colleagues in preparing this conference and to contribute to shedding light on this issue. Protecting children in times of armed conflict. Please, Professor, the floor for you, Laura Guercio.
Thanks, Ahmed. Thanks, Dr. Fatlawi. I would like to thank you for your great cooperation and for your tirelessly help to finalize this conference. The University's Network for Children in Armed Conflict is very delighted to have organized this conference in collaboration with the University of Kufa. On behalf of the Network Coordination Committee, allow me to thank Your Excellencies, Mrs. Safia Taleb Al-Suail, Iraqi Ambassador to Italy, and my deep friends, Mr. Bruno Antonio Pasquino, Italian Ambassador to Iraq, all the speakers and participants for attending this conference. Special thanks to the President of the University of Kufa, Professor Dr. Yasir Lafta-Assoun, for his cooperation, as well as I said before to Professor Ahmed Al-Fatlawi, who has always supported the network's scientific work and has collaborated tirelessly with the network's organizing team to finalize this conference. Today's event is one of several meetings planned by the network, which recognize that spaces of analysis and debate among academic community, institution, and civil society organizations are key elements for the implementation of human rights, especially regarding to the most vulnerable, such as children in armed conflict. Very briefly, allow me to recall that the network was established in November 2020 with the support of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs International Cooperation, thus demonstrating Italy's long-standing commitment to the issues of children in armed conflict, as already mentioned before by our Italian ambassador. The first network's activity held in November 2020 was in an academic week on the situation of girls in armed conflict, in which all the university's members participated through seminars, lectures, webinars, and other academic activities. Since then, the network, which is now made up of 45 universities and university representatives from all over the world, has been working not only on the creation of spaces for judicial and social analysis, debates, and sharing of experience, such as today's conference, but also on organizing professional trainings and research activities aimed at proposing concrete measures and recommendations. Why an international universities network focus on children in armed conflict? Because the academic community is addressed to young people and it cannot therefore remain insensitive to the drama affecting those children who, because of the war, are denied their right to live and grow. Against violence, the academic community can use only, I can say only, but it's not only, the tools of dialogue, knowledge, and respect for others and their rights. They are less noisy than bombs and mines, but they are stronger than all the weapons of destruction over time. And they are certainly more effective when used in accordance with institutions and civil society organizations. This conference, organized in collaboration with the University of Kufa on preventive measures to counter violence against children in armed conflict, is only the beginning of the network's engagement with our Iraqi colleagues and friends. As reported by the United Nations Secretary General's 2020 report, in Iraq, like in every situation of armed conflict, children were affected by grave violations resulting from extreme violence perpetrated during the Daesh presence in Iraq, including recruitment, sexual violence, bombing, attacks on school, and military uses of school, as Mrs. Safia Al-Suail remembered before. Allow me to say that I have had several opportunities to learn about the great sensitivity and ability of the Iraqi people to react and face the drama of the war. It has been 10 years since I first visited and worked in this country, and I have had the opportunity to learn how the Iraqi men and women I have met are deeply and tenaciously committed to human rights implementation. Therefore, I'm not surprised that the United Nations report I mentioned earlier also provides an outline of the progress made in improving the situation of children in Iraq, as Mrs. Al-Suhaili recalled before. Of course, challenges remain, but only if all the actors involved cooperate closely, we will be able to overcome any defies. The University's Network for Children Armed Conflict is ready to work towards this goal with our Iraqi friends and colleagues from the University of Kufa and other Iraqi universities, as well as civil society organizations and all institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for your excellent speech. Now, the floor for me. The international law was not concerned with the granting children a private right in the international and non-international armed conflicts until lately compared to the rights granted to the other categories, particularly the civilians, because children are part of them. A good proof for this is that the Security Council did not discuss children recruiting issue until 1998. The growing targeting of children's private rights, particularly in the non-international armed conflicts, is a negative sign in the international law, confronting the violations which went out of the traditional framework. The armed conflicts, through the emergence of new phenomenon represented by children recruiting to carry out terrorist acts. The capacity of international, especially humanitarian as well as human rights, seem to be weaker in the face of mass violations against children. And this matter calls us to confront the phenomenon of targeting children directly and indirectly by tightening restrictions and ensuring that those responsible for these violations do not escape from the justice. Yes, the IHL almost moved after the violations, and now it is very important to focus on preventive measures to account violations against children in armed conflicts. Also, yes, the international criminal courts were succeeded in prosecuting many of the accused persons, but the matter is not over yet, as many violations still continue without prosecution. This matter calls for rethinking through structural mechanisms regarding respect for the rights of children, especially during armed conflicts. The level of international effort must move from denouncing to the level of monitoring the parties' compliance with the provisions of international humanitarian law, particularly with regard to the rights of the child, because the expected effects of not doing so mean that a new generation of children and instability in their society, all because of the factors surrounding children, especially the psychological and mental effects arising from the weak educational health capacity, as well as other rights related to human dignity. Now, at these moments, we will transfer to keynote speakers. Mr. Amin Bakhtiar, former Minister of Human Rights in Iraq, will join us as keynote speaker in this conference, and we are sure that he will shed light on the important aspect of the conference topic. The floor is for you, Mr. Amin Bakhtiar. Did you hear me? Mr. Amin, تسمعني؟
there's apparently a technical problem. Do you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm really sorry. I was trying to unmute, but it didn't work. It was blocked. So good. Sorry for this delay and for this technical problem. Good morning in Italy, and good afternoon in Kufa. My greetings to all of you. Allow me first to express my profound gratitude to all the organizers of today's conference, in particular the University's Network for Children in Armed Conflict, Professor Laura Guercio, Dr. Simona Lanzellotto, and Professor Dr. Yasser Lafta Hassoun, the president of Kufa University, and Mr. Chairman and Professor Ahmed Al-Fatlawi of Kufa University for your very gracious efforts in this critical time of COVID-19. Excellencies, distinguished professors, ladies and gentlemen. Throughout the history of mankind, children have been used in armed conflicts. In modern history, children were used in many conflicts, from the 80-year-old Serbian Momcilo Gravic, who fought the Austro-Hungarians during the World War I in revenge of the killing of his family, his father, mother, grandmother, his 3 sisters, and 4 of his brothers. His house was also set on fire. Momcilo survived because he was not at home when it happened. His father had sent him to his uncle earlier. To the 12-year-old British soldier Sidney Lewis, who fought the Battle of the Somme by the armies of the British Empire and French Third Republic against the German Empire in 1916, and to the Gallipoli campaign, otherwise known as Çanakkale, children as young as 15 fought in the trench. 120 children fought in the Aubais or the 15th Company with no known survivors. To the German boys and girls during the Second World War, as young as 8 were reported as having been captured by American troops, with boys aged 12 and undermanning artillery units. Girls were also being placed in armed combat, operating anti-aircraft or flak guns alongside boys. In a joint statement by Margot Wallström, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden, and Leila Zarouki, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, they stated that throughout the world, hundreds of thousands of children go to sleep each night, not with their favorite teddy bear or doll beside them, but with a gun. When they close their eyes, they do not replay the happy and innocent memories of their day, but instead fight to keep from their minds the horrors they have seen that day. There is no loving parent to tuck them in. Indeed, many shudder at the footsteps approaching their bed. This is the experience of child soldiers around the world. Around the world, nearly 250 million children are living in countries affected by conflict, and tens of thousands of them have been recruited and used as child soldiers. Despite this reality, we are making progress in ending this horrific and cruel practice, which robs children of their future. In our region, Middle East, we are about 5% of world's population, but facing more than 50% of world's violence. And many children, women, and others are victims of this violence. The entire region is unfortunately in a turmoil, from Libya to Syria, Yemen, and beyond. Today, if we talk about the scale of the problem, thousands of children are recruited and used in armed conflicts across the world, often referred to as child soldiers. These and girls suffer extensive forms of exploitation and abuse that are not fully captured by that term. Child soldiers are any children under the age of 18 who are recruited by a state or non-state armed group. These boys and girls Some as young as 8 years old serve in government forces, terrorist organizations, and armed opposition groups. They may fight on the front lines, participate in suicide missions, forced to be suicide bombers in markets and schools, and act as spies behind enemy lines, messengers, lookouts, or used as cooks and porters in support of war efforts, human shields, serving as forced brides or for sexual purposes as sex slaves for fighters or wives by male fighters. It's almost impossible to know the exact figure, but it's estimated that there are 250,000 child soldiers in the world. Today, in at least 20 countries, about 40% of child soldiers are girls. Some estimates that girls make up an estimated 10 to 30% of child soldiers used for fighting and other purposes. Some have returned to their communities, have had unwanted pregnancies during their times with rebel groups. So not all are actually used as soldiers. The more accurate term for them is children associated with armed forces and groups, CAFAG. Abduction is the most common method by which child soldier recruitment takes place. In short, there are two primary ways children can become child soldiers. They are abducted or conscripted through coercion or severe threats, or they are born into forces or groups. The abducted children from their parents are taken to training camps, brainwashed, and hand them a gun and force them to fight. They are forced to kill their own relatives and shoot fellow soldiers who try to escape. The UN has identified almost a score of countries and territories where children have been widely used as soldiers. These countries are including Afghanistan, Burma, Central African Republic, Chad, Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo, India, Iraq, already mentioned by Mrs. Ambassador El-Suhail about ISIS and abducting children of Yazidi community and other communities up in territories occupied by them in Mosul province and beyond. And in occupied Palestine, Yemen, Philippines, Somalia, Sri Lanka, Sudan, South Sudan, Mali, Nigeria, Thailand, and Uganda. 8 governments, Burma, Myanmar, Chad, Congo, India, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, Sudan, and Uganda have signed the treaty, but still use children in their armed forces or support armed groups that recruit children in their territories or neighboring states. Experts say child soldiers are often effective, trusting, vulnerable, and often intimidated. Armed forces can manipulate children easily. They do not eat very much food and they do not have to be paid. Soldiers take advantage of this and use children as pawns in their dangerous battles. In combat, children can be daring and tenacious, particularly when under the influence of drugs, a common practice, or when compelled by political or religious zeal. In some countries, such as in Sierra Leone, taking drugs, especially amphetamine and cocaine, was a regular part of military training. Because children are often physically vulnerable, easily intimidated, and susceptible to psychological manipulation, they typically make obedient soldiers as part of their training for violence. Child recruits are often subject to grueling physical tasks as well as ideological indoctrination. Although child soldiers are not morally responsible for their actions, children are often forced into fighting and have little choice over whether or not they enlist. The recruiters of child soldiers also use drugs and alcohol to make children more compliant and to enable them to commit acts they would not ordinarily commit. The recruitment and use of children in armed groups violates their rights. The grave violations against children in times of war are killing and maiming children, recruitment and use of children by armed forces or armed groups, attacks on schools or hospitals, rape or other sexual violence against children, abduction of children, denial of humanitarian access to children. These experiences can cause girls and boys physical, emotional, mental, developmental, and spiritual harm. Among war-affected children, child soldiers are more likely to endure harsher psychological consequences, such as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, hostility, sadness, self-confidence, and inability to cope with daily life. Even children are released or escape. They may find their families have been killed in conflict, or sometimes the children are rejected by their own communities, especially girls who have had babies with soldiers. According to the 2019 annual report of the Secretary General of United Nations on Children and Armed Conflict, more than 12,000 children were killed or maimed in conflict zones. Child victims who have been forced or lured into armed groups suffer a broad range of human rights violations and abuses, including the right to life, right to not be subjected to sexual violence or other forms of torture, right to education, a right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Recruiting and using children under the age of 18 as soldiers is prohibited under international humanitarian law, treaty, and custom, and is defined as a war crime by International Criminal Court. A UN treaty prohibiting the forced recruitment or use of children under the age of 18 in armed conflict, the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the Involvement of Children in Armed Conflict has been ratified by 126 countries and entered into force on February 12, 2002, a date commemorated annually as Red Hand Day. But child soldiers are still being used in over 20 countries or territories, including some that have ratified the treaty. The United Nations Security Council has adopted Resolution 2427, aimed at providing legal framework for mainstreaming protection, rights, well-being, and empowerment of children throughout the conflict cycle. The resolution has won unanimous approval of the 15 members of the Council. The resolution strongly condemns recruitment and use of children in armed conflicts, as well as their recruitment, killing and rape, maiming, and other forms of sexual violence and abductions. It also condemns attacks against schools and hospitals and denial of humanitarian access by parties to armed conflict and all other violations of international law committed against children in situations of armed conflict. It demands that all relevant parties immediately put end to such practices and take special measures to protect children. It also emphasizes responsibility of all states to put end to impunity and investigate and prosecute those responsible for genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and other egregious crimes perpetrated against children. On Iraq, the Ba'ath Party in Iraq was the first in the region in institutionalizing the child soldier organizationally in the structure of the party and beyond in the names of Al-Tala'i, vanguards, and Al-Futuwa, juvenility or youth. The first modern use of child soldiers in the region was actually during the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, although Iranian law based on the Quranic Sharia had forbid the recruitment of children under 16 into the armed forces. In Iraq, several atrocious crimes against children were committed by ISIS, as mentioned by others, speakers, like recruitment and use as combatants and suicide bombers, as well as sexual abuse. The verified number concerning rape and sexual violence is unknown because of the fear of stigmatization, reprisals, and lack of resources prevent victims from reporting these violations. ISIS caliphate coups, Ashbal al-Khalifa, are the children's military organization of this terrorist group. They recruited and abducted thousands of children to become part of the ISIS terror network. Many minors have been undergoing military training in ISIS camps, where they are taught in particular how to use light and medium weapons, but above all, how to normalize and legitimize violence with ideological brainwashing. In 2014, ISIS occupied 9 provinces in Syria and Iraq, 6 in Iraq, declared Raqqa in Syria and Mosul in Iraq as their capitals. The area ruled by ISIL or ISIS was bigger than area of United Kingdom. According to the United Nations, ISIL had massacred 5,000 Yazidi men and kidnapped about 7,000 Yazidi women and girls who were forced into sex slavery in Sinjar or Shangal in Mosul province in August 2014. Between 4,200 to 10,800 kidnapped or captive Yazidi women have been subjected to physical and sexual violence, including systematic rape and sex slavery. They have been exposed in markets in Mosul and in Raqqa, Syria, carrying price tags. Yazidi girls in Iraq, allegedly raped by ISIL fighters, have committed suicide by jumping to their death from Mount Sinjar. Thousands of children were kidnapped by ISIS. Some kidnapped children brainwashed by ISIS and turned against their families. Other communities such as Christians, Shabak, Turkmen, and Kakai, along with the major Iraqi groups such as Shia, Sunni, and Kurds, all suffered tremendous injustices in the hands of these terrorist thugs. Now, the way forward. Children who have been released from armed groups need support to go back to their families, schools, and communities, to reduce the psychological impact of children's experiences by providing safe spaces where they can play, learn, develop life skills, and thrive with other boys and girls. Children needs to be supported back into education, either in schools or through accelerated learning programs. Older children should be given vocational or work skills training to present them with future opportunities. Children who have been associated with armed groups often face stigma and rejection. We need to work with communities, families, and teachers to ensure that children are accepted back.
Did you hear me? I think you have 2 minutes. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I will try to conclude soon. And to ensure that children are accepted back into their communities and supported to be children again. In the past 20 years, tens of thousands of former child soldiers have benefited from rehabilitation programs designed to help them rejoin society. Stronger UN action against governments and armed groups using child soldiers, including Security Council, arms embargo, and other sanctions against persistent violators, persecution of military leaders who recruit or use child soldiers, universal ratification and enforcement of the optional protocol, and increased support for the rehabilitation and reintegration of former child soldiers are imperatives. In conclusion, I would like to recognize and commend the work of groups like Amnesty International, hundreds of thousands of young men and women in Red Hand Days campaign in many countries, and the UN for their work to end the use of child soldiers in wars. Also, to all those who helped the Yazidi children and all other Iraqi children victims of Daesh terrorism. In particular, we have to not forget the situation in Al-Hol camp, where we have about 30,000 family members of ISIS and others. Many are Iraqis, and there are about 60,000 of people there. And I also recognize the work of Child Soldiers International and War Child, which is actually a London-based organization, War Child, a Canadian organization, UNICEF. So the international community remains gravely concerned by the human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law committed by all non-state armed groups, including those who commit acts of terrorism, including abuses and violations such as mass abductions and sexual and gender-based violence, particularly targeting girls, which can cause displacement and affect access to education and healthcare services, and emphasizing the importance of accountability for such abuses and violations. And thank you very much for having me, and sorry for the length of my intervention, but I didn't know in the beginning that it will be limited to 10 minutes, but thank you. And I have it written, so I submit it to Laura and Simona if anyone is interested in the longer version. So there is a written statement available. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amin Bakhtiar, former Minister of Human Rights in Iraq. I think it's very important to share us this information, I mean critical information about the situations of children in times of armed conflicts, especially in Iraq, and especially when ISIS controlled many places in Iraq. Thank you very much. Now we are welcome Professor Fausto Bocar, former judge of the International Crime Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and ad hoc judge for ICTY. I'm sure we will listen to his keynote speech, which reflects Professor Bocar's long experience. This distinguished matter calls us to better understand the mechanisms of preventive measures to reduce mass violations against children in times of armed conflicts. The floor is now available to you, Your Excellency, Professor.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I'm very honored to participate in this first event with Iraqi friends dealing with organized by the network to deal with children violations in armed conflicts. My thanks are especially to the University of Kufa, its rector, and its academic authorities, in particular to you, Professor Ahmed Al-Fatlawi, that organized in your university this event. Of course, I wish to extend my thanks. I will not, for reason of time, name them to all those who preceded me in addressing this event. And I will not dwell on the violations and the sufferances of Iraqi people in recent times, because these have already been mentioned by speakers that preceded me. I will just try to give a couple of thoughts on the prevention of what has to be done to prevent the exposure and the violations of children in armed conflict, and to try also to address briefly the question of the accountability of the violators, of the perpetrators of these violations. First question: what should be done to prevent violations? I think that the first measure to be taken is to ensure respect for humanitarian law and human rights law. It's not done enough, clearly, in that respect, but we should be aware that legislation exists. Some legislation exists. One can improve the legislation, but the essential is to implement international legislation. We know that in armed conflict, I'm speaking in particular in domestic armed conflict, what is called a domestic armed conflict, which does not mean that are conflicts with no international influence, but those conflicts that see normally the state on one side, government on one side of a state, and non-state actors on the other side, even if sometimes they call them state, as it was the case in Iraq, but they are not states, they are just groups. So just to be clear in legal terms. Now, if we look at the legislation, at the existing legislation, there are a number of measures that have to be taken, and they are in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are a number of rules that are applicable even in armed conflicts. And there are rules in international humanitarian law. I'm speaking in particular of the second additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions dealing with non-international armed conflicts. It's well known, or it should be well known, that Article 4 of this protocol clearly says that some measures have to be taken in order to not to expose children to the violence occurring in armed conflicts. And it may be strange, but the best measures that is indicated in the law is to respect the right to education. Right to education should be respected, because what have children to do, which are the obligations of children, is to go, is to be educated, obligation they have, and they should not have other obligation. The rest should be left to their freedom. There is, the protocol says something more, says that in the same paragraph, says that children have to be removed from the areas of hostilities. Now we really know very well that especially in non-international conflicts we are dealing with, normally the area of the military operations is a part of the country, not all of the country. Now, the first measure to prevent the violation of the rights to children is to keep them away from the area of hostilities, to remove them from there and bring them to another area. The protocol says clearly, it speaks of removal from the areas of hostilities temporarily to a safer area, and ensure they are accompanied in a safer area in the country. So this should be done. It's of course an obligation of the state where the conflict is carried out, but it's an obligation of the entire international community. Why does not the international community work in putting together measures in order that when there is a conflict in country A, children are separated, brought to another area of the country and kept there in schools, going on their normal life of education, and when they are not at school, of leisure. So this would be the first point to me, is to apply strictly the humanitarian law provisions that we find in international instruments. To my knowledge, that provision is not applied at all. It's never applied. So, but plans, measures should be done also at the international level in order to intervene in those situations, because the concern for children is not just something that concerns the state in which there is a non-armed conflict. It's something that should concern the entire international community. Children are a concern for everybody in the world. And the fact that the Convention on the Rights of the Child has been ratified practically by the whole international community shows that there is a concern in that sense. So this is the first point I would like to stress. The second issue I want to deal with very quickly is accountability. We have to bear in mind that prevention must be coupled with prosecution of those who commit violations that are, as we know, it has already been said even here, are crimes against humanity or war crimes, depending of the context in which they are committed, and are of concern that too of the whole international community. Now, here the legal framework is represented now by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, although there is even a wider framework in customary international law. The problem is that the court inevitably cannot take all the cases. So it's impossible to imagine an international court that takes all the cases. The court can have may have a leading role in dictating case law, in dictating jurisprudence, but clearly cannot deal with all the cases. So national prosecution is of essence. States must exercise prosecution in these cases when there are international crimes, and the principle of complementarity in the statute also invites or provides for an obligation of states to do so. The problem is sometimes that one does not have the domestic legislation to do that, or the legislation is not updated to the point of dealing with this type of crimes. And I welcome what Ambassador Al-Suhail just said, that there is an updating in the Iraqi legislation on this matter. Of course, there is the difficulty of the non-retroactivity of the criminal law to be taken into account. When you update the legislation, you can't go back to the crimes committed before the legislation. But there is customary international law. All these crimes are protected under customary international law, and we know that the ad hoc courts like the ICTY for Yugoslavia, like the ICTR for Rwanda, have applied not retroactively the law, have applied customary international law which existed even before the establishment of the tribunals. So one can work on that basis and lead courts to apply customary international law which pre-existed the commission of the crimes. So this is something on which we should work out. We should work better, and I'm ready to do it, of course, as far as the situation of this country of Iraq is concerned, as well, of course, situation in other countries. I had a certain experience in applying customary international law in my capacity as a judge, so I would certainly give my contribution if necessary. This is what I wanted to say. I wanted to be brief, but to go straight to the essence of our meeting today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bucar, for your sharing us your experience as a judge, as a professor. I think you shed light on critical issues in two sides. I mean, remedy side, and I think it's very important to focus on this issue. I mean, and preventive measures and remedy measures. Now we welcome my dear colleagues, Ms. Simona Lanzellotto. She will be moderating the discussion with the speakers. Here we must mention our thanks for her great efforts that she exerted with us throughout the preparation of this conference. My dear, the floor now is for you. Did you hear me?
Thank you very much. Yes,
Thank
I
you.
do. Thank you very much, Professor Fatlawi. I want to thank again the University of Kufa for hosting this international conference. Thanks to your excellencies. But I don't want to steal time from our distinguished speakers. So I will give immediately the floor to Dr. Omar Meki, Regional and Legal Advisor for the International Committee of the Red Cross. Please, Dr. Meki, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me to speak at this conference today, which tackles one of the most pressing issues in contemporary armed conflicts, and particularly in the Middle East. It is such a pleasure to see how many of us are willing to sacrifice their weekends if devout time to address such important topic. I guess this is the least that we can offer to a largely neglected victims of our world today. In this spirit, I will try in my very short intervention to tackle 4 key topics that lie at the heart of the protection of children under international humanitarian law, which is also the main focus of the organization that I work for and its humanitarian operations across the region. But before I delve into these 4 topics and focuses, I first want to say a few words on the rationale underpinning these legal special protection for children in armed conflicts, generally speaking. As you all know, customary IHL provides that children affected by armed conflicts are entitled to special respect and protection, whether in international or non-international armed conflicts. This obligation is reflected, as Professor Pukar said, in the many more detailed rules of the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols that articulate specific measures for the treatment of children. The rationale for this special protection is that children are particularly vulnerable to the effects of armed conflict. And here's the ICRC noted 2 reasons for this particular vulnerability during the drafting of the additional protocols that I thought that it might be interesting to be shared with you just as a start to this intervention and perhaps as a reminder to why we do what we do in this field. So the first reason is that, or the first comment is that the psychological traumas caused by war often leave ineradicable impressions on children. And perhaps the second reason is that children might not have the same capacity to understand the danger and risk inherent in certain situations, especially when it comes to child recruitment. The ICRC at the time observed that although children ran precisely the same risks as adult combatants, unlike adults, they don't always understand what await them for participating directly or indirectly in hostilities. So having said that, the first element that worth being highlighted in my intervention today is on the provision of recruitment and use of children by armed forces and armed groups. As rightly been mentioned, customary IHL as well as the 2 additional protocols address the issue of child recruitment and specify that children must not be recruited into armed forces or armed groups, and that children must not be allowed to take part in hostilities. And of course, a number of international human rights law instruments complement these IHL rules and borrow pretty much their wording, including the almost universally ratified Convention on the Rights of the Child, and separately its optional protocol in the involvement of children in armed conflict, which, as you all know, adopts a relatively higher standard in this regard. So ICRC, also to shed the light on the work of my organization, ICRC works with the states on the domestication of the provisions of these conventions in their national legislation. In addition to many Arab states that have this integrated in their national legislation, we recently succeeded to amend the laws of a few countries in the Middle East by integrating a provision that criminalizes the recruitment of children under the age of 18. This includes Syria, for instance, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, and we are working with many other states toward the same end, hopefully, inshallah. Yes, indeed, adopting national legislation is only one piece of the puzzle to prevent recruitment, but it's certainly a necessary piece to set the normative framework, as highlighted by Professor Pukar, who I owe a big part of my knowledge on international criminal law to him. He was my professor in the United States in 2008 in the LLM. So I am very grateful to that the word had played his magic to get me to sit with him on the same panel. And to for the same reason, the normative framework here is basically is a stepping stone to orient the trainings and dissemination and ultimately to form the basis of accountability and prosecution later on. So this is the first angle of our work when it comes to the provision of recruitment and usage of children in by armed forces or by armed groups. The second element of my intervention is basically focused on another important challenge that we face in armed conflicts nowadays, which is detaining children for reasons related to armed conflict. As you all know, in armed conflicts, children may be detained either on account of their own conduct or status, or because members of their family are detained. And the two scenarios are unfortunately very common in this part of the world. In this situation, in addition to the key protections that IHL provides to any person deprived of his or her liberty, specific rules are in place to protect children in this part, of course, where families are accommodated together. Detained children are entitled to tailored age-appropriate treatment. This age-appropriate treatment includes access to education, recreation spaces, and food and medical care in keeping with their psychological needs and so on and so forth. In this regard as well, ICRC visited in 2020 only more than 5,000 children that are detained for reasons related to the conflicts in the Middle East. This was done in order to ensure that they are being treated humanely and receive the appropriate treatment that they deserve. Now I come to the third element of my intervention, which tackle another challenge in conflict zones nowadays, namely, as Mrs. Ambassador said, the access to education for children, and as also Mr. Ambassador highlighted in his opening speech. Of course, beyond the rules of the conduct of hostilities that we all know, which protect schools and students and civilians and civilian objects, which in the interest of time, I will not discuss at length now, perhaps in the questions and answer, if any. IHL also contains a family of rules specifically aimed at ensuring that education continues in armed conflict. In this regard, ICRC, in addition to the bilateral work that we have with the governments and particularly with the ministries of education across the region, and I guess Dr. Ahmed Fatlawi is a good witness of this, this year we initiated in coordination with the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, a set of trainings on the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict. This indeed based on the Safe School Declaration that was flagged by Mr. Ambassador earlier. It was launched in Oslo in 2015 and was widely supported by states, and it highlights the broad impact of armed conflict on education and outlines a set of commitments to strengthen the protection of education and ensure its continuity during armed conflict. My last element for today's intervention is on restoring family links when a child is separated from his or her family in a situation of armed conflict. IHL also, as you all know, contains rules that seek both to ensure that the child's needs are met while they are separated, and to reestablish context and ultimately the reunification of family members when possible. In this regard, ICRC in 2020 only also, I'm trying to get a recent statistics, reunited almost 100 children with their families across the region, and more than 500 other separated children, their cases are being processed as we speak today. This is not to speak about the efforts that we exert on the negotiations with states to consider the repatriation of their national children associated to foreign fighters and their family who are stranded in conflict zones, like in Syria, a whole camp, or Iraq, Yemen, Libya, you name it, with respect, of course, for the family unit and the principle of non-refoulement, of course, as a way to build peace in the region and ensure a safer and more humane future for the next generation. We are acutely conscious that protecting these children, especially in these particular contexts, is not an easy task, and that it requires enormous resources, political courage, and good doses of compassion that we know at times feels undeserved. But nonetheless, we still hope that things will get better. And for that, we certainly count on you and all the other concerned stakeholders to help us solve this problem and to together garner the acceptance of states that child is a child, even those who are allegedly associated with groups designated as terrorists. And at the end of the day, I believe that it's our job as international law lawyers to convince the rest of the world that the children are entitled to the protection that the law grants to them, even if this will cost us our almost inexistent weekends. By this, I end my intervention, and I apologize if I spoke for too long, but I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to benefit from the interventions of my fellow panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Maki, for sharing all the concrete and fruitful work of ICRC on many topics, from recruitment to detained children, education, and unification and repatriation of children coming from conflicts. But now I will give the floor to Professor Dr. Khalid Khudair Daham from the Alamein Institute for Postgraduate Studies in Iraq. Please, Dr. Daham, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Simona, Dr. Laura, Dr. Al-Fatlawi, and many thanks for University's Network for Children in Armed Conflict. And my greetings to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to be a speaker in this conference. I will conclude my paper that I wrote in Arabic language, and I thought that this conference would be held in Arabic language. And before 1 hour, I tried to conclude my my paper in Arabic language in English language. And sorry for this conclusion. I will start with the subject of preventive measures to confront violence against children in armed conflicts. Is very important topic, this. And this topic is of a particular importance in Iraq in light of the grave violations that committed by the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS, Daesh in this area that were subject to its control in Iraq and Syria before the organization, defeat, and liberation of those areas in Iraq. The terrorist organization control over these areas lived through the in this community from the grave violations that were committed, and children who are subjected to grave violation of their rights that are internationally and internally organized. The terrorist organization committed the crimes against children from many underage recruitment, murder and incitement to murder and enslavement, sexual torture, ill treatment, and other crimes. The grave crimes has ended for the rise of violation for this children who be in the north of Iraq, Mosul, Salah ad-Din, Al-Anbar, in Iraqi region. This issue raises important question. Perhaps the most important of which is a preventive measure to confront violence against children in armed conflicts. The question is how to deal with the children who are victims. The second question is how to deal with children whose families or one of its adult members have been involved with the terrorist organization in committing crimes. And how can the shame stigma that the organization brought to them to be dealt with, and how to help them to overcome all these difficulties. The protection of children in times of armed conflict is not only a moral or legal need toward the child, who is a weak element of society. It is also a supreme social need closely related to the security and stability of society. So what is the state allocation funds, resources, and capabilities to provide security and stability to society? This will not be sufficient without giving the protection to the children and their families. Now we would like to focus on the Iraqi constitution. In Article 29 in Iraqi constitution 2005 is indicated or stated that the family is the base of society. The state maintains religious, moral, and values. The state guarantees the protection of motherhood, childhood, and old age, and grants all forms of violence and intolerance in the family, school, and society. The Iraqi legislature has passed a number of relevant laws, including the Iraqi Penal Code for 1969, in accordance with the Iraqi Juvenile Care Law 1983. Iraqi has ratified a number of documents, International Convention and Geneva Convention for 1949, and it is the additional protocols 1977. The functions of the Child Protection Organization, physical support services, and case management. Tens of thousands of children have been exposed to violent conflicts and displacement due to Daesh, ISIS. And this is determined to the physiological and social health of the child, while the available physiological support services are needed. Improving the child protection services for victims of armed conflict due to the apparent lack of services provided to these children. Working to solve the problems of social norms harmful to families that we confuse with their children or member of ISIS, and building the design of realistic programs to help this family and its member into society in light of the apparent lack of working human resources. I will try my colleague Simona to conclude some issues that I think is very important to be held for Iraqi legislator. Iraqi legislator has an obligation to amend some articles in Iraqi Penal Code, because the penalties that legislator enforced to the member of families or the person who is responsible for child is not enough. So we can find if we return to the Iraqi Penal Code, we could find not enough punishment for this responsible person responsible for the child. And I think this article, these laws needs to be amended and enforce many obligations upon the family or the person who involved or responsible for the child. In the end of this, my words, I would like to give many greetings to you, and I am sorry for the abbreviation or conclude this Arabic paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Dam. Thank you for your overall view of the situation of the children in Iraq, in particular, and their protection in Iraq. Now I will give the floor to Professor Ruja Fazeli from the Trinity College, Dublin. Please, Professor Fazeli, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simona, and also thank you, Professor Fatlawi and Professor Guercio for your invitation to today's conference. So just to explain, I'm going to take a slightly different view, well, not view, but a very contextual and socio-religious approach to my presentation. I will speak briefly on the topic of children in situations of armed conflict from a gendered lens, and I will use the Iranian context as a case study, where one has to first of all contextualize the recent histories of the revolution and to highlight the importance of martyrology within Shia Islam, and I suppose statist Shia Islam here as well. So I depart from the previous speakers, and I'm not going to talk much about the legal protection. So in Shia Islam, no other event has contributed more to martyrology than the martyrdom of the Shia Imam Hussein in Karbala on Ashura, 10th of October, 680. The martyrdom of Hussein is seen not only symbolic as a model for all martyrdom seekers, it has become a defining symbol for Shia Muslims of the profound injustice of the world. The role of women in martyrdom in Shia Islam is intrinsically linked to the events of Karbala. The women of Karbala are, on the one hand, regarded as those who needed protection, and on the other, revered as strong women, strong because they coped with the loss of their men. In particular, Zainab, Hussein's sister, the granddaughter of the Prophet Muhammad, stands as the symbol and embodiment of this vulnerable strength. The story of Karbala, as one of the major historical accounts of martyrdom in Islam, is one dominated by male martyrs, with Hussein often being called Sayyid al-Shuhada, Lord of Martyrs. Women have more often been regarded as proud mothers of martyrs, self-sacrificing, becoming the emblematic symbols of a nation at war. Following the model of martyrdom established by Zainab, women were accordingly encouraged to send their sons along the path of martyrdom in Iran. This is during the Iran and Iraq war specifically. The image of the sacrificial mother, a mother who sacrifices his son for her homeland and her faith, was also used during this time. The well-known slogan of the 8-year war was Behesht zir paye madaran ast. Paradise is underneath the feet of the mothers. The mother of martyrs fill a very specific gender role, similar to the role of Zainab, the one that she filled in Karbala. In an interview, the mother of Hossein Fahmideh, a 13-year-old child soldier who became known as a heroic martyr and whose life and sacrifice Iranian students studied in government-issued textbook talking about state propaganda, spoke of her pride in having offered her son to the path of God. She stated, "I'm proud of being the mother of a martyr and a child such as Hussein, who I offered as a present in the path of God, Islam and my faith. And I hope God will accept this small gesture from me." The Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 88, saw Iranian boys between 10 and 14 years of age involved in fighting. Often, these child soldiers were used for mine clearance, sent through fields with plastic keys around their necks, so as to be able to open Heaven's Gate when they died. Some commentators seize on this religious symbolism to highlight their religiosity, as well as the deceptive methods used by the Islamic Republic to convince minors to enlist. Certainly, some child soldiers who volunteered or were volunteered by families for the war effort approached it as a religious duty. At the same time, other scholars have highlighted the substantial recruitment of boy soldiers from poorer Shia families who expected the boys to work and help support their families. Childhood was not seen as a time of leisure or educational development. And another argument focuses on the gendered ethos of the Iran-Iraq war alongside this economic dimension. Soldiering offered poorer boys autonomy in relation to both girls and also more privileged classes of boys. It allowed them to claim a masculine space distinct from the wartime domestic sphere, which was otherwise now populated almost solely by women, girls, and older men. According to Ahmadi, in addition to financial and agentic incentives, the war zone ethos and its masculine homosociality also made the front line appealing to poor and working class boys who preferred the education of the war front to that of the school. Contemporary and historical understanding of childhood in Iran must be grounded in the intersecting factors of religion, class, and gender. It is important to remember as well that there is differences between the age of maturity for boys and girls in Shia Islam. Boys are minors up to the age of 15, girls are minors up to the age of 9.
Professor Fazeli for giving us the opportunity to analyze the topic of children soldiers under another perspective, such as the social religious perspective, which is very, very important. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Anna Maria Rufino from the University of Campania, Luigi Vampitelli. Professor Rufino, the floor is yours.
Voila, okay. Thanks, Simona. Hello, everyone. Here are some of my brief considerations on the possibility of environmental regeneration in the sense of intervention aimed at restoring a social fabric context to children and girls in which to envision their life. We cannot ignore a reconstructive premise in short of historical facts, nor can we ignore the idea of having to reconstruct literally that idea of a life, which boy and girl do not have today. The issue of violence against boys and girls involved in war events concern many countries in the world, but take on an even more complex scope in territories such as the Iraq one, and in many other countries that we have talked about in other occasions. This complexity is determined not only by the succession of historical facts that we all know, determined by international dynamics, but also because in those countries precisely starting from the many war events that have taken place in this almost year, violence against civilians and as widespread and macroscopically generalized. A violence that appeared to us, however, much more incident than the many countries we are paying attention to. That is the country where the involvement of boys and girls is evident. I'm naturally thinking of the many African countries that we have taken into consideration. In this sense, I think that the action to be taken from the reintegration of boy and girl involved the enlargement of the visual field in order to identify interconnected action precisely to cope with the complexity I was talking about in other occasion. Displacement of masses, refugees, displaced person, infant mortality due to decreased vaccination, territories polluted by depleted uranium, birth defect are the main critical elements from which we must start to try to imagine effective intervention in order to right dignity to girls and boys involved in a many perspective life. I cannot fail to reiterate also for the Iraq case, as for the other situation we are observing, the absolute lack of information on the effect of the war, which is seen even further away and remain unknown, despite the enormity of the violence, especially sectarian. We know well then that there has been talk of a crime against humanity, a genocide in many quarters. However, I repeat, the context is seen as distant and unknown. I remember some dramatic data, the kidnapping of over 900 children in Iraq, indoctrinated and military trained, and an equally dramatic number of women and girls who were instead reported as victims of sexual violence. We know that the United Nations has asked the government to use all means at its disposal to ensure compliance with the law and order, necessary condition for the voluntary return of internally displaced persons in their place of origin. The number of victims, as we know, does not reflect the level of suffering of civilians. And we also know that many of those civilians died from lack of access to food, water, and medicine. People who have been indirectly affected by the violence suffer a disastrous health situation, also in terms of food emergency, destruction of the social, educational, and emotional fabric. Therefore, the total lack of essential services, hygienic. These civilians are mainly made up of women, children, and live in very difficult conditions without the medical assistance. And most importantly, without the presence of school or rehabilitation education program, also as an hygiene education. Many children and women have died from dehydration, but also from neglect. Abandonment. In short, respect for human rights of the population is also a fundamental factor in avoiding the return of extremist movement. But respect for human rights must also and above all begin with the reconstruction of the social, family, and emotional fabric that is so often denied to boy and girl. But the recent visit of the Pope in Iraq has certainly drawn attention to the serious social situation, not only in Iraq, but only in those countries. For this reason, today more than in other moment in the history of recent years, it is necessary to take the opportunity to take effective action. The environmental and structural intervention must be accompanied by action that can allow the social fabric to be recreated. This can and must be done by starting from the basic fabric of those territories. By basic fabric, we must understand the primary institution, such as the family and training, obviously without underestimating health and the risk of prevention interventions. Starting from primary institution, which also involve adults such as a family member, parents, brothers and sisters, adults obviously, and by training a staff that can adapt the main basic training tools, an active and the proactive response can be mended from the very base and thus give back to boys and girls their visual on the future. The basic fabric is, and when restructured, function as a mechanism of recognition and self-recognition, as an activator of trust and security. This mechanism is activated through elementary tools, which are communication, sharing, the creation of behavioral and relational models, but also creative one. These are all essential basic elements to define a look of trust toward the future, restoring their fundamental rights. In conclusion, I'm convinced that in addition to political institutional action, structural and social regeneration go hand in hand. Indeed, the reciprocal functionality can favor the reintegration of boys and girls involved in such dramatic events. In this sense, sorry, but it came to me in French. In this sense, I would define action as environmental regeneration. Thank you a lot of.
Thank you very much, Professor Rufino, for your relevant presentation. Time is running, so I will have to ask the next speakers to be brief as much as possible. So now I will give the floor to Professor Jean-Marie Fritz from the University of Cincinnati, United States, and the University of Johannesburg. Professor Fritz, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. And I first would like to thank everyone for inviting me to take part. I am a member of the network, but the University of Kufa has a big responsibility for this forum, and I think that's a wonderful thing that they've put this in place, even if it's very, very early in the morning here in the United States. This is a very serious topic, and I'm happy to take part. First of all, I'm a clinical sociologist, so I'm not a lawyer. I do represent the International Sociological Association to the UN. And I wanted to talk about a couple of things. First, we have a global failure here dealing with our children. Different countries, it plays out in different ways. We certainly just look at the SDGs and we can see hunger, poverty, education, all of these are important, just as the security of our children. But it plays out in other ways too. Frequently in countries, there are ways in which we penalize children, for instance, for delinquency, or we treat them, even if something they've done as a child, we treat them as an adult in terms of penalties. So it's nothing that is simply a problem of one part of the world or one country. You could even look at adoptions. Sometimes children are left, and it's a very long time before somebody takes them into a family. We have many ways we need to address the needs of children. And one today that we're talking about is security. And armed conflict plays out in many different ways as well. If we look at what's going on in Nigeria, we have a section of the country where we have armed gangs taking children, and they're making money from this because people are paying for the release of the children. And it's meant that children often now are not going to school because parents and children are afraid of putting them there. We have a worldwide crisis in figuring out how to deal with the needs of our children and protecting them. I wanted to talk about two things today. I'm a clinical sociologist, and that means intervention. How do you do something? How do you change something? And what I'd just like to mention is we have to pay attention to all the levels of intervention. We've had wonderful presentations so far, which have told us many of the facts of the situation. And we've talked about laws and documents that have been developed or are being developed. These could be action plans. It could be your national action plan for women and girls. It could be a specific action plan dealing with the needs of children. The point is that you have to pay attention to all levels. It's not just putting a plan in place, but it's getting people to be able to hear their voices on what they want. It's being able to work with communities, local leaders, family members. It has to be at all levels. And it's sometimes the interest is putting the document in place, but other times it has to be working on those other levels as well to be able to move something forward. So looking at what those levels of intervention are, what you've chosen to do, and when there needs to be a change in emphasis of the levels to bring something about. My last point is about, I'm a professional mediator. I'm always interested in moving problems forward by discussion. But you have to have two things in thinking about this. A lot of times, political entities choose a mediator because they are the head of the country, the friend of the head of the country, somebody they trust. I urge people to think about professional mediators in doing this. It does make a difference, and often countries don't trust the system enough to be able to try it out. In saying that, there are a couple of important points. One, if you do decide to do that, how do you get people to the table? And that is the most important thing, and you've got to try some means. That's why the first point about levels of intervention is really important. You have to figure out how to get to people at all these different levels, how to get actually to meet with somebody, to have the ear of them, and to convince them to move in a different direction. Second point might be you have to figure out what works. And as several of the speakers have mentioned, having those documents in place can be really helpful, bringing us back to an international document, a national document, a regional document. Religious tenets of how we treat each other can sometimes be very important in moving people to do something differently than they've done before. And the third point I'd like to make here under talking about mediation is sometimes facts move people forward. And frequently when we have these discussions, it's about the facts. How many children were hurt? How many children were abused? How many children were violated? How many children died? And for some people, the facts move them forward. For other people, it's the stories. And it's really important to gauge what you're doing to see to what extent that storytelling needs to be part of what you're doing. How has this affected one person? How has this affected one family? What do we do about that situation? Anyway, I'm very glad to be part of this forum. Thank you for allowing me to speak. Hearing the other speakers. Thank you, Simona.
Thank you so much, Professor Fritz, for your interesting remarks, your interesting presentation. Now I will give the floor to Professor Dragos Cilea, the President of the International Criminal Bar Association. Thank you, Professor Dragos Cilea. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Simona. It is a great day today for me to see you again after your visit in our conference in Transylvania, in Târgu Mureș, in my country, in Romania. So I want to thank for this invitation to Professor Fatlawi, to Professor Laura Guercio, and not in the last time to University of Kufa. And congratulations for this great event. I am honored to be in this important conference, international conference, and I say that it proves that we are so close, even if we are so far. We are close in our conviction about the situation of the children all over the world. Today I am representing the International Criminal Bar. I am the president of International Criminal Bar, and I will have some brief ideas about what we want to do, to work together for the children. So, like Professor Pokar present already the situation in the international justice. I must also tell that from my point of view, we must think not only to prevent, but unfortunately also in the situation that the children in armed conflict are victims. So, as I represent thousands of international lawyers, I think that the lawyers must be very close to the children that are victims. And we must prepare the lawyers. In my opinion, we must have lawyers that are specialized to assist the children that are special victims. So my association, International Criminal Bar, is open and give our disponibility to form, to prepare, to train the lawyers to be very, very good assistant for the children that are victims. So in this result, we must do, in my opinion, a proposal of a convention between University Network and Kufa University and International Criminal Bar, a convention to work together and to make some common activity in this field, to prepare the trial situation of the children's, assisted by lawyers, and also their situation in the trial. And we must be near the children, not only in ICC in Den Haag, but we must be near the children that are victims there at the place where the crimes, international crimes, are placed. So in the country where the children victims exist. So my colleague, and I want to, I know that you know this thing, that Laura Guercio, Professor Laura, is also member of International Criminal Bar. But today, my colleague that is lawyer, but also ombudsman in Romania, Professor Madalina Botina, will present our proposal of this convention. I will finish my intervention with an idea. So I think that majority of us, we are parents. So we have a vision about the children. But I am sure that all of us, we were at the time children. So we have some remember from our childhood period. So we must fight us to give to the children a childhood, a normal childhood, and to have good remember for this period that must be very, very good for all the children over the world. Thank you for listening to me. And once again, I say that I am honored to be with you in this day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cilea, for your concrete proposal to work together with us and the university, us as network and the University of Kufa, to assure the protection of the rights and needs of children victims of conflicts. So now we'll give the floor to Professor Madalina Botina from the University of Costanza. Thank you so much, Professor Madalina. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your invitation. We were very impressed by the words that the representatives of Kufa University addressed to us, and that all the other representatives of the Embassy of Italy and the foreigners showed us that we have to respect the rights of the children. If you can give me to share the screen, I will present to you the proposal that Professor and the President of the International Criminal Bar, Mr. Dragoș Chila, presented in order to make a real step forward for protecting the children, having legal representative in this way. I cannot because the host disabled participant screen sharing, but it's a proposal that we already mentioned, and it is very important to know that all the people who are here today heard this proposal, and the representatives of this important organization will work together to make it function. I will present to you today the role, as already Professor Jean-Marie Fritz presented, of a mediator. So it is very important for...
You can share your video.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
So I will... I think you can see our proposal in order to work in complex teams and complement our professional knowledge with each other, because some representatives of the university's network for children in armed conflict are also members of the International Criminal Bar. And I give the example of Professor Laura Guercio. Also, we were thinking that all of us will agree to materialize in today's conference and create action, as already President Kila mentioned, in regard to make this convention work. We hope that this agreement will be concluded as soon as possible. And in this way, we lay down the foundation for collaboration between the two associations. And here you have the International Criminal Bar and the University's Network for Children in Armed Conflict. But also this activity, as I said earlier, will achieve its objectives and the respect of the noble activity to carry out in order to defend the children's rights and maybe also the women's rights who are affected by armed conflict. Also, as earlier I mentioned, the role of a mediator. Professor Fritz already mentioned this. We have an institution in Romania which guarantees all the rights of the citizens, but most important, the rights of the children. Of course, Romania thinks and implements a specific immigration policy at this moment, depending on the needs identified at the national level, and in the same time concerted, because we are UE member states, and we have to ensure fair treatment of immigrants and their harmonization, integration into the host society. So Romania is exposed to migration routes, legal and illegal, from Eastern Europe countries, but also for Middle East and Southeast Asia or Africa. That is why we have a special representative, a deputy of the People's Advocate, who protects children. It is called the Ombudsman for Children. This department for the defense, protection, and the promotion of the rights of the child is coordinated by the Romanian's ombudsman. So what are the main powers? To promote and protect the rights of the children up to the age of 18 to uphold and encourages the respect and the promotion of the children's rights under the Romanian laws, of course, but also to solve the individual complaints made by children or their representatives, and to solve any complaint regarding the violation of one or more rights of the child, and to promote the rights of the child among children and adults in order that they be familiarized with these rights. And as already some speakers mentioned, to collaborate with the formal organization of children and to extend this with other authorities. So there are many possibilities for a country to adopt their legislation and to defend the children. An example, a real example in our country was that the representative of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees referred to the institution of the People's Advocate in Romania, pointing out that in recent months, this organization received several notifications that several children have remained in a regional center for accommodation and procedures for asylum seekers in Bucharest, which is administered by the General Inspectorate for Immigrations. These children would be accommodated with adults, which is not very good, and the legal representatives are appointed late for them. So we have to see what was the real situation in this center. And at the time of the investigation, the center housed both accompanied and unaccompanied minors with different status as follows. A number of 29 minors seeking asylum in Romania, 9 minors with refugee status, and 2 minors who were granted subsidiary protection. So for the minors which were not accompanied, there are 15 of them, 14 with asylum seekers and 1 with subsidiary protection. Of these, 4 are under the age of 1 year. So after the ombudsman went in that protection center, we gave a recommendation in order to appoint a legal representative for these children and to take over a residential center for those under the age of 1 year. Also to survey only 9 minors, which were there also. So we, as already I said, we have to see the conditions in which the children were held there. So we have to take care of all these rights. And this Regional Center for Accommodation and Procedures for Asylum Seeker in Bucharest has applied for the appointment a legal representative for all unaccompanied minors, as well as for taking over in a residential service for the ones who were up to 1 year of age, but also for one of the minors over the age who expressed agreement in this regard. This is what the Ombudsman makes in Romania, and of course it can be also a step to the representatives, the authorities in the countries which are in armed conflict, to take this kind of institution who mediates between citizens and other authorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Botina. Of course, we would really we would be really glad to collaborate and to participate to this agreement proposal. So thank you very much again. Now I will give the floor to Dr. Maha Al-Sakban, doctor in Baghdad and a member of the Iraqi Network Group on Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan. Dr. Al-Sakban, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for offering this opportunity to present about situation of Iraqi children and during armed conflict, particularly girls. As we know, all children have the right to be protected from violence, exploitation, and abuse. Yet, millions of children around the world from all socio-economic background, age groups, religious and cultural, suffer daily from violence, exploitation, and abuse. Children are among the most vulnerable to armed conflict victims, and women and children may be the main victims of armed conflict. They are their goals, and they are also used as tools during these conflicts. Their suffering manifests itself in several ways. In the midst of armed conflict and elsewhere, children are killed and elsewhere, children are killed or mutilated, orphaned, abducted, deprived of education and healthcare, and left with profound emotional scars and psychological trauma. Displaced children, uprooted from their homes, are vulnerable to dangers. Girls face additional risk, especially sexual violence and exploitation. All of these groups of children are victims of armed conflict, and all of them deserve the attention and the protection of the international community. Children are especially vulnerable to dangers as they are less aware of these dangers and are less prepared to adapt or interact with conflicts. At the same time, children are not responsible for the conflicts, but suffer disproportionate suffering from its transgression. Children represent the hopes and the future of every society, so their destruction means the destruction of the society. In striking contrast to the commitment of the international community and the significant progress that has been made on the agenda for children and during armed conflict, grave violations continues to be alarmingly committed against children in the cases concerned. An additional factor of great concern is the evidence and fact that children are not only victims of armed conflicts, but they are also taking up arms and playing a positive role in conflicts that occur in many countries of the world. And it was mentioned at the Second International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent concerning the peace of September 1984. Children in many countries receive paramilitary training in which they learn how to use weapons. Here, it must be pointed out that Iraq has witnessed a similar situation since the 90th of the last century, as military experience were conducted on Iraqi children, especially middle and middle school students. And the matter continued in another way following the US invasion of Iraq, as depends on children increased, whether through including them with the Iraqi resistant or armed militias, and intensive training was being conducted for them, some of which carried the so-called martyrdom operation. The government has not allocated budget for it within the national budget law. Legislations like personal status law and law to combat domestic violence are still manipulated by political parties to achieve a political gains. They are not yet approved. And child rights legislation draft is not yet also being approved by the government. Although we have also one legislation that have been approved, it is about the Yazidi survivors of ISIS. Thank you very much.
Sorry, okay, thank you so much, Dr. Al-Sabban, for your enlightening contribution. Now we'll give the floor to Dr. Noor Musa from the Advocacy and Campaigning Coordinator of Save the Children in Iraq. Dr. Musa, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona, and thank you everyone for hosting this event. And I would want to give a special thanks to University of Kufa, which I am an alumni of. I did my BA there. So I just, as a Iraq-based NGO, I will just give you what we think is a priority if we want to help support the protection and ensuring education and child rights implemented in Iraq. We do really think that what the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor working on is great towards the child law and updating the child policy, and we would want a further push towards that. So this network could be a great tool to be pushing for speeding up the process and also involving some points around children in conflict. The other thing is, as the ambassador, the Italian ambassador, His Excellency talked about the SSD, the Safe School Democracy member, and I've been attending training with the Ministry of Education, and the guidelines are understood, but the implementation of the guidelines needs also a further push, and as Save the Children, we are happy to support with that. So this is also something that we need to work towards, ensuring that schools in Iraq are safe and available only for educational reasons. The other thing that we would want also some focus around, to share some focus around us undocumented children. We recognize the efforts by the government and international actors around this issue, but we also recognize that as long as this continues, these children are prevented from their rights to education, to health services. So the push is needed for that as well. Undocumented children and also children affiliated with ISIS. So this is something that we really think would be great to focus on, and as Save the Children, we would be happy to support with. When it comes to how us, Save the Children, would be able to support, we do also think that strengthening the law and the policies, Iraq needs that. There are very great policies and laws, but there are some missing, there are gaps, and some updating is needed. And as international organizations, embassies, this international knowledge can support the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government is in need of support when it comes to financial, not only financial support, but also technical and knowledge support. So this is something that we highlight as a need. And the other thing is data. I think everybody addressed this. There's a huge data gap. It's very difficult to collect information around this topic or anything. And the efforts around this are not limited, but also they require support. I'm sorry, there's a coffee machine here, so this is the noise. So this thing, the data gap and the systems that we need to work towards. And the other thing is also, we are talking about a community and children. We need also to empower them, to have voices, to also be able to know what is there, to know how to facilitate the system, to also report and be part of the partnership, not only with the government, but also with the communities. So this is also something that we should also consider in platforms like this. How do we highlight this? How do we empower these children to know their rights, the communities, how to ensure that children are protected during conflict, and how to also proceed in the future with that. So that's all for me, but I want to thank you again for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Musa. Now, thank you all the speakers for their contribution, very interesting and enlightening contribution. Now we'll give back the floor to my colleague Laura Guercio for the final conclusion of this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simona, and thank you, Ahmed, for your important work done for this conference. Time flies and we are behind the expected time, so let me just say that all the speakers today propose very concrete issues and very interesting food for thought, as it has also emerged from the number of comments, questions of the audience that we received in the chat. Please forgive us if we cannot address question from audience to our speakers because of the time, but certainly in this question will all be considered as the basis for the organization of a series of activities that the university's network intends to launch in the coming months. As Her Excellency Ambassador of Iraq to Italy and His Excellency Ambassador of Italy to Iraq have pointed out, we must continue to focus on protecting the right of children involved in armed conflict as a duty, not only for children themselves, but also for global peace and stability for all. It's a common commitment, as the multidimensional agenda of children in armed conflict can only be effectively implemented through the synergies of all stakeholders involved, coordinated with each other, as, allow me to say, musical instrument of the same symphony orchestra. In allowing me to make this similitude, I would like to move to real song that is a short version, that is the real version actually, of the university's network song, Let Them Play, promoted also by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, describing through the language of art the drama of the 6 grave violations against children in armed conflict. Before listening to and seeing the music video, let me thank again all your excellencies, speakers, especially our friend, Professor Jean Fritz, who from United States woke up in the middle of the night to be today with us, and participants for attending this meeting. Together, we can effectively work for safeguarding the affected armed conflict children's rights and ensuring to grow. Thank you, and let's see very soon, surely.
Laura, can I add something? I would like to.
Sure. I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you very much.
To conclude, but it's my. I'm very delighted if you take the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for you, for your efforts with Simona, with all participants in this a great conference. Many thanks for President of University of Kufa, Professor Yasser Lafta. Many thanks for our Dean at Faculty of Law, Professor Saeed Ali Ghafel. Many thanks for University's Network for Protection Children in Times of Armed Conflicts. I'm grateful for all the speakers. I think it's good chance to focus on this issue, especially in this time, I think, because there are many armed conflicts currently, and there are many children facing the atrocities in many places, especially in the Middle East. Many thanks for Sergio Lovino for his excellent efforts by editing the video, the first video and the second video, which will end the conference, and sharing us to play with the dreams to protect children in times of armed conflicts. We can share the last thing. I mean the video. Thank you for you. Thank you for Simona, and goodbye. We can share this video now.
little souls with eyes so fragile, who dream of living in a colorful world, suspended in the uncertainty of tomorrow, wounded by an incomprehensible world, dressed in rage and cruelty. Then it's time to join us all. Take our hand, don't be afraid anymore. In the sky, the hand of light will deliver a lift to your heart. We will write your future on a blackboard. We will take care of your wounds. We are your present, you will be our future. Little souls, now you are safe. Dark souls, guilty of an incomprehensible world, or interrupt their sleep, injury their pureness, turn them away and for home. Let them play with their dreams, so that when they finish sleeping, they will not be afraid to open their eyes. Then it's time to join us all. Take our hand, don't be afraid anymore. In the sky, the hand of light will deliver a lift to your heart. We will write your future